Ever wish you had a cheat code to really grasp a complex subject, to cut through the noise and get right to what matters?
Yeah, like a shortcut to the core issues.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what we're aiming for on today's deep dive.
Oh,
We're plunging into a truly fascinating and at times provocative piece of source material. A comprehensive document titled Debunking Islam, a Christian Critique.
right. And this particular document sets out to rigorously examine the core claims of Islam, but, from a very specific stated perspective, a Christian one.
So our goal in this deep dive is to carefully unpack the arguments presented within this critique.
Exactly. We'll explore its claims point by point,
Huh?
look at the evidence it offers, and how it challenges what the document itself calls the standard Islamic narrative.
Okay, so this deep dive is all about helping you become well-informed on one specific critical analysis of the topic. We'll ensure we present the material with the clarity and the objective tone our deep dives are known for, allowing you to form your own informed understanding.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the arguments being made in this source.
So what can you expect? We'll go through theological, historical, ethical, and logical points raised by the critique.
And even look at its suggestions for dialogue, which is interesting.
It's a journey into understanding a particular perspective on a major world religion, offering some, surprising facts and thought-provoking insights along the way, according to the source.
Okay, so let's start with the framework. What does this critique actually set out to do?
Good question.
The source, Debunking Islam, a Christian critique, explicitly states its purpose right up front. It aims to provide a thorough yet respectful, that's their word, investigation of Islam's core claims.
Right.
And the specific goal is stated as empowering Christians for meaningful dialogue.
Okay.
It seeks to determine if Islam is, as the critique puts it, a divinely revealed faith, or alternatively, a human construct shaped primarily by its 7th century Arabian context.
And they even cite scripture to frame that search, right?
They do. They reference 1 Peter 3.15, emphasizing a search for truth with clarity and love. That's the stated aim.
That's a crucial framing, understanding its declared objective. The document then defines what it calls the standard Islamic narrative, or ISN, as they abbreviate it.
Right, dissent.
This narrative, according to the critique, is the widely held belief that the Quran is the perfect, unaltered word of God, impeccably preserved and revealed directly to Muhammad.
It positions Muhammad as the last prophet, born around 570 A.D. in Mecca, receiving divine revelations via the angel Gabriel, establishing Islam and uniting Arabia by 630 A.D. That's the standard story.
And the critique asserts it will systematically examine this specific narrative against the evidence it presents.
And it certainly sets out a clear roadmap for doing that. The critique outlines its 16 chapters.
16 chapters, wow.
Yeah, starting with an introduction to Islam, its foundational texts,
Yeah.
The Quran, Hadith, and Sunnah, and the traditional understanding of Muhammad's role.
Okay, the basics.
Right, but then it moves into more contentious areas, like historical claims. For instance, the whole debate over Petra versus Mecca as the original holy site,
We'll definitely need to get into that.
and alleged variations within the Quran itself.
This is where the critique really begins its deep dive into what it identifies as various types of errors: factual, theological, logical, cognitive, ethical.
Epistemological, too, how knowledge is claimed and validated.
Right, and both internal and external contradictions. It culminates in what the critique terms cumulative arguments, before shifting to practical questions for interfaith dialogue.
So it's presented as a very comprehensive point-by-point deconstruction, all from its stated Christian viewpoint.
Okay, let's begin our deep dive into the heart of the critique then, starting with its examination of Islam's foundational texts: the Quran, Hadith, and Sunnah.
Sounds good. The source highlights the central Islamic belief that the Quran is the literal, perfect, complete, and error-free word of God. It cites certain Quranic verses as the basis for this claim.
But the critique immediately challenges this idea of the Quran's perfect preservation. It brings up some surprising historical accounts, for example, what it refers to as the goat incident.
The goat incident. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
The source cites reports found in Hadith collections. These are the sayings and traditions attributed to Muhammad, where Muhammad's wife, Aisha, reportedly recounted how certain Quranic verses about stoning an adult suckling were written on paper under her bed.
Okay.
And a goat allegedly ate the paper, causing those verses to be lost from the final compilation. That's the story cited.
Wow. Okay, so a lost verse due to a goat.
Yeah.
And it's not just Aisha's report.
No, the critique notes that Umar, another close companion of Muhammad, also apparently confirmed a stoning verse was revealed but then not included in the final Quran.
So the critique points to this as evidence suggesting a loss of actual text, not just interpretation.
Exactly. And beyond these individual accounts, the critique references academic work by scholars like Dan Brubaker, who studied early Quranic manuscripts, like the Sana palimpsest, and found evidence of corrections, deletions, and additions.
Right. The palimpsest showed text written over earlier, erased text.
Yes. And the critique interprets this as suggesting a textual evolution rather than a static, perfectly preserved text from the very beginning.
It also cites J. Smith, who claims there were potentially up to 30 different versions of the Quran in early Islam.
30 versions.
That's the claim cited,
yeah.
Including versions by companions like Ibn Masud, who allegedly omitted certain chapters, and Ubay, who reportedly added others.
Okay, so how does the critique present the Muslim counter-arguments to these points?
Well, the critique explains that Muslim counter-arguments typically explain seemingly lost verses through the concept of abrogation, the idea that later revelations cancel out or modify earlier ones.
Okay, abrogation.
And they also argue that strong oral tradition, memorization and passing down the text verbally, secured its preservation even before everything was written down perfectly.
And what about grammatical issues or style?
They suggest the Quran's unique linguistic style, known as iltifat, explains certain grammatical shifts that critics point out. And historical or scientific critiques are often dismissed as needing metaphorical interpretations rather than literal ones.
But the critique, from its perspective, isn't convinced by these counter-arguments.
Not really. It asserts that abrogation fundamentally undermines the very claim of perfect preservation from the start. If verses can be lost or canceled, how perfect was the initial revelation? That's the question they pose.
And the linguistic style.
It contends that iltifat is insufficient to explain away all the grammatical issues raised, and that metaphorical interpretations don't address why a divine text would be misleading or contain apparent errors in the first place.
What about the oral tradition argument?
The source argues that while oral tradition is powerful, it's still susceptible to human error, especially over decades. It specifically cites the historical loss of many expert reciters, the Hufaz, in early battles like the Battle of Yama in 633 AD.
Right, suggesting gaps could have emerged.
Exactly. Fewer people knowing the complete text perfectly.
The critique also zeroes in on what it labels as specific grammatical errors within the Quran itself.
Yes, it refers to a list of over 20 syntax errors allegedly identified by a scholar known as Al-Fadi.
Can you give an example?
Well, one cited example involves a specific surah's use of a female pronoun for the command wait, which the critique argues is grammatically incorrect in that specific Arabic context for a direct command to men and women.
Okay.
It also notes that early manuscripts, like the Sana and Samarkand ones, appear to show grammatical and spelling deviations from the standardized text we have today.
So the critique isn't just focusing on lost verses, but also alleged internal linguistic issues.
Correct. And then it turns to historical and scientific claims that the source contends are inaccurate within the Quran.
Such as?
For instance, it highlights what it calls a biblical misrepresentation. Mary, Jesus' mother, is referred to as sister of Aaron in one surah.
Right, Aaron being Moses' brother.
Exactly. The critique argues this confuses her with Miriam, Moses' sister, who lived many centuries earlier.
Okay, what about scientific points?
Cosmological misunderstandings are highlighted. The critique points to a surah depicting the sun setting in a muddy spring, and another describing the sun and moon floating in orbits.
Suggesting.
The critique suggests this implies a geocentric view, the Earth at the center, which it contrasts sharply with modern astronomy.
And it continues with what it labels as biological claims.
Yes, the critique mentions the Quranic claim that humans are created from a clot or drop of blood, alaq. It argues this contradicts biblical accounts of creation from earth or dust.
Is the flat earth idea mentioned?
It raises the question based on a surah which asks, and how is the earth spread out? The critique suggests this wording implies a flat plane.
The source also extends its critique to certain hadith reports regarding hygiene and health.
It does. It references a hadith about dipping a fly entirely into a drink if it falls in, claiming one wing has disease and the other the cure. The critique calls this microbiologically unsound.
Okay. Any others?
It also cites hadith that describe contaminated well water, or water from a pond containing a donkey carcass, as being permissible to drink under certain conditions. The critique argues these defy modern understanding of hygiene and microbiology.
There are other specific points of contention mentioned too, right? Like the moon splitting.
Yes, the splitting of the moon, mentioned in Surah 54. The critique asserts there's simply no independent astronomical or historical evidence for such a massive, globally visible event.
And Alexander the Great.
He's referred to as Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran and portrayed as a righteous monotheist. The critique notes this is contrary to historical accounts of Alexander being polytheistic.
What about the crucifixion of Jesus?
The Quran's denial of Jesus' crucifixion in Surah 4.157, claiming someone else was made to look like him, is sharply contrasted by the critique with Roman and Jewish historical accounts, which widely confirm the crucifixion took place.
And anatomical points.
Anatomically, the critique points out Surah 86, which states sperm emerges from between the backbone and the ribs. The source argues this is biologically incorrect based on modern anatomy.
The critique also touches on what it calls borrowed material in the Quran.
Yes, it points to similarities between certain Quranic stories, particularly about Abraham destroying idols, and narratives found in Jewish midrash. It suggests Muhammad may have incorporated local folklore or existing stories into the revelations.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the Hadith and Sunnah themselves, the sayings and practices of Muhammad. How does the critique assess their reliability?
This is a major point for the critique. It highlights their late compilation. The major Hadith collections, like Bukhari and Muslim, were compiled 200-300 years after Muhammad's death, mostly in the 9th and 10th centuries AD.
That's a long time for oral transmission.
Exactly. The critique contends this raises significant doubts about their accuracy. How much change or embellishment could have occurred over generations of purely oral transmission?
Does it find issues within the Hadith collections?
Yes. The critique points out what it identifies as contradictions between different hadith, even within supposedly Sahih or authentic collections. For instance, one hadith in Sahih Bukhari allowing temporary marriage, while one in Sahih Muslim forbids it.
And the Sunnah Muhammad's way of life.
The critique argues that the Sunnah often reflects 7th century Arabian cultural norms rather than universal divine guidance applicable for all time. It cites practices like Muhammad's marriage to Aisha at a young age as an example of a cultural norm, not a timeless divine command, from its perspective.
How does the critique view the standard Muslim counterarguments about the strength of the oral tradition and the chains of narration, the isnad system?
It acknowledges those arguments but finds them insufficient. The critique's assessment is that these traditional Muslim responses haven't, from its viewpoint, adequately refuted the objections about the time gap, potential for error, and internal contradictions.
So the conclusion on Hadith and Sunnah from this critique is?
It concludes, in its view, that they are essentially later and unreliable compositions, reflecting more about the time they were written down than about the actual 7th century events or sayings.
Okay, so if the foundational texts are questioned, what does this analysis mean for the figure at the very center of Islam, Muhammad himself?
Right, the critique moves to examine Muhammad, questioning whether he fits the bill of a prophet or should be viewed more as a historical figure shaped by his time.
And it revisits the satanic verses incident.
Yes. According to early Islamic sources cited by the critique like Al-Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, Al-Tabari, Muhammad allegedly inserted verses praising pagan goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, into his recitation.
Under influence.
Under what he later claimed was satanic influence, yes. These verses were then retracted. The critique emphasizes these accounts come from early Muslim historians.
Does the Quran itself mention anything like this?
The source notes that Surah 22.52 in the Quran does seem to address Satan interfering with or influencing a prophet's recitation or desires.
So what's the critique's main implication from this incident?
It's significant. If this incident is accurate, the critique argues it undermines Muhammad's claim to infallibility. It suggests he might have spoken presumptuously in God's name, potentially failing a biblical test of a true prophet found in Deuteronomy 18, which warns against prophets speaking words God hasn't commanded.
Does the critique acknowledge that many Muslims today deny this event happened?
Yes, it notes that some later Muslim scholars deny it, suggesting the verses were uttered by disbelievers or misinterpreted.
But the critique pushes back.
It does. It points out that early Muslim historians seem to accept it and argues that even the Quranic verse itself, Surah 22.52, acknowledges a prophet's potential vulnerability to satanic influence.
Okay, a major point raised next by the critique, and this is quite provocative, is the claimed lack of contemporary evidence for Muhammad's actual existence.
This is a big one. The critique notes that the oldest surviving biography, Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasul Allah, was written around 767 AD, That's over 130 years after Muhammad's traditional death date.
And we don't even have the original.
No, it only survives through a later revision by Ibn Hisham from 844 AD, more than 200 years later. And Ibn Hisham himself admitted he omitted parts of Ibn Ishaq's original that he found questionable or embarrassing.
That's a significant time gap for historical verification. How does the critique contrast this?
It contrasts it sharply with, for example, the detailed accounts of Jesus' life found in the Gospels, which were written within decades of his death by eyewitnesses or those who knew them.
What about non-Muslim sources from the 7th century?
The critique observes they are very sparse regarding Muhammad. An Armenian source by Sebios mentions a Mamet leading Arab conquests, but the critique notes it provides few specific details linking him clearly to the traditional Islamic narrative.
And archaeological evidence.
The critique also points to an alleged archaeological absence, a lack of 7th century coins, inscriptions, or other artifacts bearing Muhammad's name, or clearly referencing the events of early Islam as traditionally understood.
What about the Dome of the Rock? That's early.
It mentions the Dome of the Rock inscription from 692 AD, which does mention Muhammad. However, the critique suggests this could potentially refer to a title, meaning praised one, rather than definitively proving the existence of the specific historical person described in the Surah.
This leads the critique to explore some alternative revisionist theories.
Yes, quite radical ones. It delves into hypotheses of two Muhammads, perhaps a peaceful Meccan preacher distinct from a later Medinan military leader, or even the idea that Islam evolved more gradually, perhaps without a single founder figure like the traditional Muhammad.
The idea being the story was constructed later.
The idea explored is that Muhammad's story might have been standardized later, perhaps in the late 7th or 8th century, to provide a unifying narrative for the expanding Arab Empire and legitimize its rule. J. Smith is cited again, noting the earliest reliably dated Muslim record mentioning Muhammad by name is that 692 AD inscription.
How does the critique address the Muslim counter-arguments here, like the strength of oral tradition?
It presents the Muslim counter-arguments, emphasizing strong oral tradition, preserving accurate accounts until writing became widespread, and citing sources like Sebios as proof of historicity.
But the critique remains unconvinced.
Yes, the critique argues these counter-arguments rely heavily on later Islamic sources, which it considers potentially biased. It stresses the lack of independent, contemporary verification from the 7th century itself.
Okay, let's turn to another compelling argument presented in the critique: Muhammad's alleged failed prophecies.
Right. The critique introduces a biblical test for prophets from Deuteronomy 18.2022. The key idea is, if a prophet makes a prediction in God's name and it doesn't happen, then that prophet is not truly from God.
So it applies this test.
Yes, to specific prophecies attributed to Muhammad in the Hadith. First, it focuses on the prediction of the world's end occurring during his generation.
Where is that found?
The critique cites specific Hadith, Sahih Muslim 41.70050, Sahih al-Bukhari 4.55.605, where Muhammad allegedly told followers that the Day of Judgment would come while they, or the youngest among them, were still alive.
And the critique's observation?
Simply that over 1,400 years have passed, and it clearly hasn't happened. So, failed prophecy number one, according to the critique.
Okay, what's next?
The critique examines the prophecy concerning the conquest of Constantinople by Muhammad's immediate followers. It references a hadith, Sunan Abu Dawud 13.4294, where Muhammad reportedly predicted this.
And the outcome?
The critique points out that Constantinople was eventually conquered, yes, but by the Ottoman Turks over 800 years later in 1453, not by Muhammad's direct contemporaries, as the prophecy allegedly stated. Failed prophecy number two, per the critique.
Is there a third one mentioned?
Yes, the critique highlights a hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari 2.24.497, where Muhammad allegedly predicted his community would become so wealthy that eventually no one would be poor enough to accept charity.
And the reality?
The critique simply states that poverty has, unfortunately, persisted throughout history in many parts of the Muslim world. Failed prophecy number three.
How does the critique contrast these points?
It contrasts these alleged failures with what it identifies as Jesus' fulfilled prophecies. It cites Jesus predicting his own death and resurrection, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which happened in 70 AD, and argues Jesus fulfilled numerous specific Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, according to the critique?
The critique directly poses the question: if Muhammad predicted the end of the world in his generation, why didn't it happen? It really challenges the listener. How can one trust a prophet, it asks, if their specific predictions fail?
And it contrasts this uncertainty
With what it calls the rock of Jesus's fulfilled prophecies, presenting them as a foundation of trust that, it argues, is missing from Muhammad based on these examples. It's asking you to weigh this specific evidence presented in the source.
Okay, let's move to another fascinating and highly debated argument within the critique, the question of the true original holy site. Petra, not Mecca.
Right. The standard Islamic narrative, as we know, places Mecca in Saudi Arabia as the undisputed spiritual center, home of the Kaaba, where Muhammad received revelations, the focus for prayer, Qibla, and the Hajj pilgrimage.
But the critique directly challenges this traditional view. How?
It primarily references the work of J. Smith and others, outlining 4 main reasons argued in the source for why Petra, the ancient Nabatean city in modern-day Jordan, might have been the original holy site of Islam.
Okay, reason number 1.
A claimed striking lack of 7th century historical evidence for Mecca as a major city. The critique asserts that no contemporary records, Islamic or non-Islamic, confirm Mecca's significance in the 7th century. Consistent mentions only appear much later, in the late 8th century.
Whereas Petra,
in contrast, was a well-known, well-documented major trading hub for centuries before and during the 7th century.
Okay, reason number 2.
Geographical inconsistencies in the Quran, according to the critique. It argues that certain descriptions in the Quran, references to vegetation, agriculture, nearby locations like Sodom, align far better with Petra's relatively fertile environment and geographical location than with Mecca's harsh desert landscape.
Can you give examples?
Sure. The location of Lot's people, Sodom, near the Dead Sea, is only about 80 kilometers from Petra, but over 1,000 kilometers from Mecca. Quranic references to fruits like grapes, pomegranates, figs, and olives are more typical of the Nabatean region around Petra than Mecca. It cites Patricia Crone's research suggesting Mecca's trade importance has been greatly overstated in traditional accounts.
Interesting. Reason number 3, this one sounds quite dramatic.
It is. The critique cites Dan Gibson's research on the Qibla, the prayer direction, of very early mosques. Gibson surveyed over 50 mosques dated between 622 and 750 AD.
And his finding.
His research allegedly shows that the vast majority of these earliest mosques were oriented towards Petra, not Mecca.
Towards Petra.
Yes. The critique proposes this, suggests the prayer direction only shifted towards Mecca later, possibly during the reign of Caliph Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century, maybe as part of consolidating power and establishing a new Arab sanctuary.
Okay, that's a big claim. What's the 4th reason?
The critique circles back to Islam's reliance on oral traditions and what it calls weak historical foundations for the Mecca narrative. It notes the standard Islamic narrative depends heavily on oral traditions for the first 200 years, with the key biographies and histories only compiled centuries later.
Like Ibn Hisham's Surah in 844 AD.
Exactly. The source argues that relying on oral tradition recorded so much later, often by non-Arabs living far away in places like Iraq, introduces significant potential for error, legendary accretion, and even deliberate reshaping of the narrative.
Are there other supporting arguments mentioned for the Petra theory?
Yes. The critique brings up a few more points from revisionist scholarship. It highlights that Mecca is only explicitly mentioned by name once in the entire Quran, Surah 48.24. According to their analysis, yes. It reiterates Patricia Crone's argument that Petra's known historical importance as a major trade center fits Quranic descriptions of a prosperous city much better than 7th century Mecca. It suggests hadith descriptions of Mecca as al-Qura, mother of settlements, might be later hyperbolic claims.
Anything else?
It even interprets a passage in the historian al-Tabari about the rebel leader Ibn al-Zubayr's activities in the late 7th century as possibly hinting at a relocation of the sacred black stone or even the Kaaba itself, though that's highly interpretive.
Okay, so the critique lays out this case for Petra. How does it then address the inevitable Muslim counterarguments?
It does try to preemptively address them. For example, regarding the early mosque alignments point to Petra.
Yes.
The critique notes that Muslims might argue these deviations were due to errors in calculation, primitive building methods, or mosques having multiple rebuilds.
But the critique rejects this.
Yes. It contends these explanations assume builder error without strong evidence, potentially reflecting confirmation bias, trying to make the evidence fit the established narrative. It even hints at potential funding bias, influencing some academic research in Islamic studies chairs.
What about the geographical references in the Quran?
The critique presents potential Muslim arguments that references to Lot's people relate to caravan routes passing nearby, or that fruits mentioned could fit other regions near Mecca, like Taif.
And the critique's response?
It views these interpretations as stretching the context to fit the standard Islamic narrative, SIN, ignoring Petra's much closer geographical proximity for many references, and sometimes relying on ad populum arguments saying it must be Mecca because everyone believes it is.
What about the lack of early written records for Mecca, the oral tradition argument?
The critique notes Muslims emphasize a strong oral culture that accurately preserved accounts. However, the critique dismisses this, calling reliance on oral tradition recorded 200-plus years later by non-Arabs an epistemological error, a fundamental flaw in how knowledge is established. It keeps stressing the absence of contemporary written records mentioning Mecca.
And the hyperbolic language in Hadith.
When Muslims argue hyperbole is common, the critique turns it around, suggesting the absence of Petra in later Hadith actually reflects the successful standardization of the Mecca-centric narrative, rather than proving Mecca was always central.
What about al-Tabari's account of Ibn al-Zubayr?
Muslims might argue his journey was for military defense, not relocating the Kaaba. The critique counters that this excludes the possibility of relocation without specific evidence and shows a bias towards the standard story.
And arguments about Mecca's harshness being a protective factor.
The critique counters that Mecca's harsh desert environment fundamentally contradicts Quranic descriptions of a place with streams, fruits, and agriculture. It argues Petra's known infrastructure fits these descriptions better, suggesting the Mecca narrative might reflect later political motives to center the empire in Arabia.
So, after laying out all these arguments and counter-arguments, what's the critique's final conclusion on Petra versus Mecca?
It's quite definitive from their perspective. J. Smith's 4 reasons, supported by other scholars referenced in the document, strongly suggest to the critique that Petra was the original holy site.
And the single mention of Mecca in the Quran.
They view it with suspicion, arguing the alleged destruction of variant Quranic texts and the leaked standardization process point to a fluid, evolving textual tradition in early Islam, making it possible that mention was added or solidified later. The source asserts the cumulative evidence strongly points to Petra.
Okay, this leads us naturally to the critique's cumulative arguments against Islam. How does it pull all these threads together?
It introduces the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. This is a philosophical idea that basically says everything must have a sufficient reason or explanation for its existence or truth.
And it applies this to Islam.
Yes. The critique argues that the accumulation of all the alleged errors and inconsistencies it has highlighted historical, textual, logical, ethical provides, in his view, sufficient reason to reject Islam as a divinely revealed religion and view it instead as a human construct.
Okay, let's break down some of these cumulative arguments. First, what the critique identifies as theological errors.
The problem, as presented by the critique, is that the Quran allegedly misrepresents core Christian doctrines like the Trinity, citing Surah 4.171. It also argues the Quran portrays God's love as conditional, citing surahs like 3.3132, and depicts a God who is ultimately distant and unlike his creation, citing Surah 42.11, contrasting this with the Christian view of God.
And the critique's conclusion from these theological points.
It suggests these theological formulations point to human authorship influenced by the specific theological debates and context of 7th century Arabia, rather than reflecting an accurate, timeless, divine revelation of God's nature.
Next, the critique moves to what it labels as logical errors within Islamic texts and arguments.
Right. It points to alleged non sequiturs conclusions that don't logically follow. For example, claiming the Quran's literary beauty or the rapid spread of Islam automatically proves its divine origin. The critique argues these aren't logical proofs.
Oh, to mention contradictions.
Yes, it highlights what it identifies as internal contradictions. For instance, verses that seem to affirm human free will versus others that emphasize divine predestination, comparing Surah 76.2930 with 10.99100, or verses advocating tolerance like Surah 2.256, no compulsion in religion, versus commanding fighting against unbelievers like Surah 9.292.
And logical fallacies.
It also claims common logical fallacies appear in some Islamic apologetics, like confirmation bias, selectively focusing on evidence that fits, circular reasoning, assuming the Quran is true to prove it's true, or appeal to authority, relying solely on Muhammad's claims.
The critique's conclusion on logic.
It argues that a perfect divine text should be logically consistent and coherent. These identified flaws, it contends, point more towards the complexities and perhaps contradictions inherent in human thought and historical development rather than divine omniscience.
Then there's the discussion of cognitive biases. How does the critique apply this?
It argues that various cognitive biases, essentially systematic errors in human thinking, can contribute to maintaining belief in Islam without sufficient critical examination from its perspective.
Like what kind of biases?
It mentions confirmation bias, again, selectively focusing on Quranic verses that seem to predict science while ignoring those with apparent scientific errors, like the sun setting in a muddy spring, Surah 18.86. It talks about the halo effect, possibly idealizing Muhammad, anchoring bias, sticking to initial beliefs, the sunk cost fallacy, making it hard to leave after investing time and identity.
Also things like bandwagon effect, authority bias.
Right, out-group homogeneity bias, seeing non-Muslims as all the same, optimism bias, underestimating negative aspects, availability heuristic, relying on easily recalled information, and cognitive dissonance, mental discomfort from holding conflicting beliefs, leading one to dismiss challenging evidence.
So the conclusion here is that belief might be psychologically driven.
The critique concludes that these cognitive biases suggest belief in Islam, for some, might be driven more by these common psychological tendencies than by purely rational evaluation of evidence, which, in its view, weakens the claim that the belief system is based solely on divine truth.
Ethical issues are also a major component of the cumulative argument.
Definitely. The critique highlights specific Quranic passages and aspects of Muhammad's life, as recorded in Islamic sources, that it argues conflict with modern universal human rights standards.
Examples being?
It points to the Quranic allowance of polygamy, Surah 4.3, owning slaves, Surah 4.24, and verses commanding violence against non-believers, like the sword verse, Surah 9.5. It also references Muhammad's military campaigns and his marriage to Aisha when she was very young.
And the critique's ethical conclusion?
It argues that a truly divine moral code should be timeless and aligned with universal principles of justice and compassion. These identified ethical issues, it contends, suggest a moral framework rooted in the specific cultural relativism of 7th century Arabia, rather than a universally applicable divine ethic.
The critique also details what it calls epistemological errors flaws in how knowledge or truth is supposedly established or transmitted in Islam.
Exactly. It circles back to points made earlier. The satanic verses incident, if true, suggests the prophet himself could be deceived, undermining the certainty of revelation. Losses in oral transmission, like reciters being killed in battle or verses being forgotten or eaten by a goat, challenge the claim of perfect preservation.
And the textual variations.
The textual variations found in early manuscripts like the Sana'a palimpsest further challenge the idea of a single, perfectly transmitted text from the beginning.
So the epistemological conclusion is?
The critique's conclusion is that if the processes of revelation and transmission themselves appear flawed or uncertain, then the core claim of possessing a perfectly preserved, unaltered divine text lacks a sufficiently strong foundation. This again points towards human involvement in compilation, in their view.
Finally, the critique wraps up the cumulative case by looking at internal and external contradictions together.
Right. It argues that the alleged internal contradictions within the Quran, like free will versus predestination or tolerance versus intolerance, mean the text fails the test of internal coherence expected of a divine message.
And external contradictions.
It argues that the alleged external contradictions where the text seems to conflict with known history, like the satanic verses narrative differing from later denials or the crucifixion account, science like cosmology or biology, or archaeology, like the evidence regarding Mecca's early importance, mean the text fails the test of correspondence to external reality.
The overall conclusion from these contradictions.
A divine text, the critique asserts, should be both internally consistent and factually accurate in its claims about the world. These identified contradictions, it claims, point strongly towards historical and cultural influences shaping the text, not purely divine authorship.
The cumulative argument also touches on human rights and coercion more broadly.
Yes. It argues that certain aspects of traditional Islamic law, Sharia, such as the potential death penalty for apostasy in some interpretations, rules regarding gender inequality, in inheritance or legal testimony, and the historical spread of Islam often involving military conquest, combined with strong social pressure for those born into the faith, can imply elements of coercion rather than purely free choice.
And this connects to the sunk cost fallacy again.
Yes, the critique suggests this combination of factors, along with the psychological weight of the sunk cost fallacy, further supports its overall argument that Islam functions more like a socially and historically constructed system, rather than a purely freely chosen, divinely revealed truth.
Okay, that's a heavy set of cumulative arguments. Now let's turn to how the critique aims to equip its Christian reader for dialogue, specifically by addressing common Muslim objections from its Christian perspective.
Right, this section seems focused on providing ready responses. Let's take the first common objection it tackles. The Bible was corrupted.
A very common point in dialogue. What's the response offered?
The Christian response, according to the source, emphasizes the extensive historical evidence supporting the Bible's textual consistency. It points to over 5,800 ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts, plus discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls showing Old Testament accuracy over centuries.
What about the Quran itself?
It notes that the Quran itself seems to affirm the Torah and Gospels that existed in Muhammad's time. It argues that the small variations found between biblical manuscripts are minor and don't affect core doctrines. And interestingly, it turns the argument around.
How so?
It points to the Quran's own alleged textual variants, like those discussed earlier from the Sana'a manuscript, suggesting this undermines Islam's own claim of perfect preservation while criticizing the Bible.
Is there a practical tip offered?
Yes, the source suggests asking something like, if the Quran confirms the Bible that existed then, why assume it became corrupted later without specific historical evidence? Comparing trusting the Bible to trusting a reliable letter from an eyewitness.
Okay, next objection. The Trinity is polytheism. How does the source address this?
The Christian response presented is that the Trinity refers to one God existing in three co-equal, co-eternal persons. Father, Son, Holy Spirit united in essence, not three separate gods.
And the Quran's view.
The critique contends that the Quran's rejection of the Trinity, Surah 5.73 mentioning Allah, Jesus, and Mary, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what Christians actually believe. It suggests analogies, like water existing as liquid, ice, and steam, might help clarify the concept of one substance, three persons, though acknowledging analogies are limited.
Any practical tip here?
Suggests explaining maybe the Trinity is somewhat like a family one unit working together with different roles, and then posing a question like, how does Islam's strict view of God's unity account for his personal relational nature as shown in the Bible?
What about the objection, Jesus is not God?
The Christian response, per the source, centers on Jesus' own actions and claims. His miracles, his claims to authority, like forgiving sins, statements like, I and the Father are one, John 10.30, and centrally, his resurrection from the dead are presented as proof of his divinity.
And the Quran's denial.
The critique asserts that the Quran's denial of Jesus' divinity lacks sufficient historical basis compared to the evidence supporting the Christian view.
Practical tip.
Share something like, Jesus' resurrection is like God's signature on his life, proving he's more than just a prophet. And maybe ask, why should we accept the Quran's limitation of Jesus to just a prophet when his life and resurrection, historically attested, suggests so much more?
Next, salvation by works, the idea you earn your way to heaven.
The Christian response, as per the source, emphasizes salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, citing Ephesians 2.8-9. This offers assurance of salvation, citing 1 John 5.33.
How is this contrasted with Islam?
The critique contrasts this assurance with what it portrays as Islam's inherent uncertainty regarding salvation, arguing that in Islam, salvation ultimately depends on one's deeds being weighed on scales on Judgment Day, with no guarantee beforehand. Use an analogy. Christian salvation is like a free gift. You don't earn it. You just gracefully accept it through faith. And ask, how do you find peace living with the uncertainty of never knowing if your good deeds are truly enough to outweigh the bad?
Okay, the objection. No original sin. Islam teaches people are born pure.
The Christian response from the source explains the biblical doctrine of original sin, that all humanity inherits a sinful nature from Adam, citing Romans 5.1-19, making everyone need redemption. Jesus' sacrifice is presented as the cure for this inherited condition.
Does it connect this to biases?
Yes, it subtly links denying original sin to cognitive biases like optimism bias, perhaps underestimating the depth of human sinfulness.
Practical tip suggested.
Maybe share. Original sin is like an inherited spiritual illness. We're all affected, but Jesus offers the cure. And ask, if humans are born pure, how does Islam explain the universal and persistent struggle with wrongdoing we see throughout history and in our own lives?
A big one, denial of the crucifixion.
The Christian response, according to the source, strongly emphasizes the historical evidence. It cites non-Christian Roman and Jewish historians like Tacitus and Josephus, who independently wrote about Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate.
And the biblical accounts.
It highlights the detailed biblical accounts like 1 Corinthians 15:3-4, written by early eyewitnesses or those who interviewed them. The critique argues the Quran's claim that Jesus wasn't actually crucified but someone else was made to look like him is historically unsupported and contradicts all early evidence.
Tip for dialogue.
Say something like, the historical evidence for the crucifixion is strong, like having multiple independent eyewitnesses confirming a major event, and ask, what specific evidence supports the Quran's claim against these contemporary historical records?
What about the claim of Muhammad as the last prophet?
The Christian response outlined in the critique is that Jesus Christ is considered God's final and ultimate revelation, citing Hebrews 1:1-2, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. Muhammad's role, it argues, lacks the unique divine confirmation of Jesus' resurrection.
Does it mention fallacies here?
Yes, it suggests that Islam's reliance solely on Muhammad's own claims about his prophethood can be seen as a form of logical fallacy, an appeal to authority without sufficient external validation, from the critique's viewpoint.
Practical tip.
Share, Jesus' resurrection is the ultimate seal on his message and identity. And ask, how does Muhammad's role supposedly supersede or complete what Jesus, confirmed by resurrection, already accomplished?
Objection. The Quran is the perfect word of God, often contrasted with the allegedly corrupted Bible.
The Christian response, per the source, reiterates the Bible's textual reliability, supported by thousands of early manuscripts showing remarkable consistency. It contrasts this again with the Quran's textual variants found in early manuscripts like Sana.
And the corruption claim.
It argues the Quran's claim that the Bible was corrupted is historically unsubstantiated, especially since the Quran itself seems to endorse the scriptures present in Muhammad's time. Use the analogy. Ancient Bible manuscripts are like time-stamped historical records confirming the text's integrity over centuries. And ask the pointed question, why would the Quran confirm the Bible as God's word if it was already corrupted back then?
The objection, God can't have a son, often taken very literally.
The Christian response, according to the source, clarifies that Jesus' title, Son of God, is theological, not biological. It reflects his unique eternal relationship with God the Father and his divine nature, citing John 3:16, not physical procreation.
So the Quran is misunderstanding.
The critique argues the Quran's strong objection is based on a misunderstanding of this theological concept.
Practical tip.
Explain. It's like a title expressing divine unity and relationship, not a human genealogy. And ask, how does Islam's view account for Jesus' undeniably unique role, miracles, and claims, which seem to go beyond just being a prophet?
Finally, the objection or claim. Islam replaces Christianity, that it's the final, perfected religion.
The Christian response from the source is that Christianity, through Jesus Christ, represents the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation, citing John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus' message of grace, it argues, offers a direct relationship with God that contrasts with what it views as Islam's works-based system.
Tip for this one.
Share. Jesus' sacrifice is presented as the ultimate bridge to God available to everyone. And ask, if Islam replaces Christianity, how does it account for the unique person, work, and historical impact of Jesus Christ?
Okay, so the critique provides these responses, but it also flips it around and offers questions Christians can ask Muslims in dialogue.
Yes, questions designed to spark thought and, from the critique's view, highlight challenges to Islamic claims.
Question 1.
How do you understand God's nature compared to the Trinity? The goal here is to prompt reflection on whether God is purely monolithic or also inherently relational. The suggested Christian answer emphasizes the Trinity, showing God as loving and personally engaged. Question 2. What do you believe about Jesus' role in nature? This aims to challenge the Quran's limitation of Jesus to just a prophet. The suggested answer highlights the resurrection as evidence of his unique divine identity.
Question 3.
How does one attain salvation in Islam? This focuses on the assurance issue, Christian certainty, versus what the critique sees as Islamic uncertainty, based on works. The suggested answer emphasizes salvation as a free gift received by faith.
Question 4.
How do you view the reliability of the Quran compared to the Bible? This revisits the textual history arguments, contrasting the Bible's manuscript evidence with the Quran's variant issues from the critique's perspective.
Question 5.
What prophecies do you believe Muhammad fulfilled? This directly contrasts Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy with what the critique argues is a lack of clear fulfilled prophecy for Muhammad.
Question 6.
How does Islam handle issues of violence and peace? This highlights what the critique sees as Christianity's core emphasis on peace and love versus Islam's apparently contradictory messages on violence in different contexts.
Question 7.
What is the Islamic perspective on women's rights? This aims to explore perceived ethical tensions in traditional Islamic teachings on gender compared to modern or Christian views of equality.
Question 8.
How does Islam handle apostasy and religious freedom? This challenges restrictions on leaving Islam found in some interpretations versus Christian emphasis on free choice.
Question 9.
What is Islam's historical stance on slavery? This is posed to highlight what the critique views as an ethical shortcoming compared to Christianity's role eventually in abolition movements.
And question 10.
How compatible is Islam with modern human rights? This broadly explores perceived tensions between aspects of traditional Islamic law, Sharia, and universally accepted human rights standards.
So after all this critique and questioning, how does the source conclude? Why does it argue Christianity remains steadfast?
It wraps up by summarizing what it sees as the core strengths of Christianity, specifically arguing these align well with what the document terms Western values, though that framing itself could be debated.
What are these core strengths, according to the source?
First, Jesus' divinity versus Muhammad's humanity. Jesus presented as fully God and fully man, proven by miracles and resurrection, while Islam, it claims, reduces Jesus to just a prophet.
Second.
Grace versus works. Christianity offering salvation as a free gift through faith, guaranteeing eternal life, contrasted with Islam's perceived works-based system with no guarantee.
Third.
Free will versus submission. Christianity inviting a relationship based on free choice and love, while Islam emphasizes submission. Islam means submission, with predestination potentially limiting choice in some interpretations.
Fourth.
Historical reliability. The critique reasserts the Bible's reliability based on early manuscripts and external sources, contrasting it with Islamic sources compiled much later with alleged biases.
Yes.
Love and forgiveness versus retaliation. Highlighting Jesus' teachings on loving enemies and forgiving, contrasted with Quranic allowance for retaliation.
Sixth.
Hope of resurrection. Jesus' resurrection presented as a historical fact, guaranteeing eternal life for believers, contrasted with Islam's denial of his death and therefore resurrection.
Seventh.
No abrogation in Christianity. Biblical truths are fulfilled by Christ, not canceled out like Quranic abrogation suggests verses can be.
And eighth.
Prophetic reliability. Re-emphasizing Jesus' fulfilled prophecies, proving his divinity, versus Muhammad's alleged failed prophecies, challenging his prophethood.
So how does the critique argue these strengths align with Western values?
It suggests Christianity resonates due to its compatibility with logic and evidence, as presented in the critique, the possibility of a personal connection with God through Jesus, its ethics of transformative love, and the certainty of hope it offers.
And the final call to action for the reader.
The source encourages its Christian readers to share this perspective and the hope found in Christianity with Muslim friends, but stresses doing so with love and respect. It suggests using personal stories, analogies, and practical steps, like inviting them to church or Bible studies.
Wow. Okay. We've just completed an incredibly detailed deep dive into this specific source, Debunking Islam, a Christian critique. We've really unpacked the multifaceted arguments it presents against the standard Islamic narrative.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. The Quran's preservation, Muhammad's historicity, the Petra versus Mecca debate, and all those alleged logical, ethical, and epistemological challenges raised in the document.
And the so what here, the takeaway for you, the listener, isn't just about the facts or the specific arguments made in this document.
Right. It's more about empowering you to engage in informed and respectful conversations in our incredibly diverse world.
Understanding how critiques like this one are constructed, the specific points they raise, and even the counter-arguments, which we've noted the critique tries to address, equips you to approach different belief systems with, hopefully, more curiosity and clarity.
It really underscores the importance of examining the foundational claims of any belief system, including one's own, and how crucial it is for you to seek knowledge from various perspectives.
So as you reflect on this exploration of one specific, critical perspective on a major global faith, here's a final thought to maybe chew on. What truly constitutes sufficient reason for any belief system to be considered divinely revealed?
It's a deep question. How do factors like historical evidence, logical consistency, ethical resonance, and personal experience shape your own understanding of truth and faith?
Definitely something to think about. We invite you to continue this journey of discovery.